If you were to ask the average college football fan what drew them to the sport, what got them into the sport, what causes them to continue watching the sport, and why it's in many cases their favorite sport, you'd probably get a lot of different answers. You'd probably get answers about the tradition and the pageantry and the stadiums and the looks of the teams and the general vibe of college football. You probably get some answers from some people that, they got into it because they're an alumni of a particular school and they still follow that team to this day. Many Michigan alumni are currently Michigan fans, and if you are, by the way, feel free to like, share, and subscribe and follow along to the channel. You probably get a litany of different answers. It depends on the person and how and when they got into the sport. Maybe they played the sport. Maybe they coached the sport. Maybe they knew people that played the sport. I could go on and on all day. For me, it's the matchups, though. For me, it's the identities clashing. It's the styles that make fights, to quote the famous cliche that people throw out left and right and all over the place, all over college football and sports YouTube and talk radio broadly. It's how one team approaches the game versus the other, and how when those two different approaches meet on the college football gridiron, what really, stands out and who's able to leverage their advantages and where they have them and what ultimately makes the difference, and then obviously other factors play in, like talent and experience and coaching. And maybe that's also it for me. It's just all the variables that go into the equation that is any given college football game. And, speaking of identities and philosophies and schemes, one thing that got me into doing this channel was talking about things like, the 2021 and 2022, and you can even add in, to a certain extent, the 2023 Michigan versus Ohio State run, where Michigan was able to take over that rivalry, largely because they had an identity and a philosophy, and they had schemes that were the perfect counterpunch to everything Ohio State liked to do. The soft narratives around those years Ohio State teams remain, while Michigan largely played great defense, ran the football. You know the gist of it. But what do you do? How do you approach the analysis of a particular game when there are no big stylistic differences? There are no schematic things that stand out. There are subtle things, and we'll get to them in this video for sure, as this is a way too early preview of Oklahoma versus Michigan for this upcoming season, because to be honest, I can't wait to start doing these. I'm kind of, not tired, but it's getting old talking about typical off-season stuff. I think it's about time, with the calendar about to turn over to the month of August and fall camp about to begin, to talk about some real football, don't you? Well, I think you would agree with me there. I would think that that's why you're here. But I start this video out kind of struggling because, this is the football equivalent, in my humble opinion, to what many of us in some of my nerd circles, if you don't mind me kind of self-disclosing for a minute in case you haven't been able to tell, I'm a giant chess playing, Magic the Gathering playing, Fallout playing nerd outside of this little venture of mine. This is what you would call a mirror match, where you have two teams that largely share identities and philosophies, that are largely blue-collar, hard-working, running the football, playing great defense, coached by defensively minded head coaches, those kinds of teams. This is two teams meeting on the college football gridiron. And in my opinion, what I think is going to happen, at least, are two teams that are about to grind out a battle similar in some ways to last season. But I think the most intriguing thing about this matchup, the one thing we can definitely talk about, is the change in the guard at the University of Michigan, now led by, yes, a defensive head coach, and a head coach with much experience, and a giant killer of a head coach in a way. And this video will largely be focused on whether or not this will be Kyle Whittingham's first big win at the University of Michigan. But if Michigan wants to win this game, coming up in week 2. They're going to have to perform a lot better than they did a season ago under Sharon Moore. Michigan largely lost that game in a few key areas. In fact, it was kind of a lesson in how a team can lose a game despite winning the rushing battle, by the way, despite being there through much of the game, at least on the scoreboard, despite putting up some plays. Bryce Underwood did have some decent completions, although I do have up on here one of the reasons why the team lost being his not so great performance in this game. Even with the defense kind of holding Oklahoma to, limited points and limited yards, Michigan largely lost that game for a few key reasons. And they remind us of what's important, especially if you want to play the style of football that Michigan wants to play to win football games. Michigan went just 3 of 14 on third down last year against the Oklahoma Sooners, completed just 9 of 24 pass attempts, failed to win the time of possession battle, which I know there's arguments out there about that, but I myself like to think that time of possession, especially when you try to play the way Michigan has classically throughout history tried to play college football. Well, maybe outside of like the Rich Rod years and some of the Brady Hoke years, but we won't talk about those on this channel. We largely like to try to memory hole those years. You play the way Michigan likes to play, you want to win the time of possession battle in most any game, because I don't think I'm breaking any news here, but the way you play good defense is you have defensive players that are well rested, and you rest them largely by keeping the ball in the hands of your offense through most of the game. But Michigan, in a way, last season also played afraid. And that was kind of a tone setter and a red flag for how Michigan would play for the rest of the season. They were afraid to use Bryce Underwood's legs in that game. In fact, Bryce Underwood technically only had 3 rushing attempts, though if I remember right, 2 out of the 3 were sacks. There were no real designed run plays for Bryce throughout that entire game, if I'm remembering correctly. Maybe someone out there has watched the film recently. I actually haven't. But on the other side of the field, John Mateer ran for 74 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, if you ask me, that's probably the biggest difference in the game. These are 2 teams that want to win the same way, and that's why I mentioned this. This is going to be a game that largely comes down to third downs, completing passes on third downs, completing passes on second and first downs, and maybe even getting some big plays, as you may see here in a minute. And 2 teams that I believe both teams in this matchup for this season will rely on a running quarterback. By the way, Michigan defensively last season also gave up far too many third and fourth down conversions, allowing Oklahoma to go over 50% on third down and 1 for 1 on their 1 fourth down attempt. I want to do something a little different in this video, though, than a lot of people do in their prediction videos, previews, what have you. Instead of largely relying on, talking about personnel and experience and things like that, I want to kind of dive into Oklahoma, who they are as a program, their schemes, their philosophy, and where the subtle differences do exist. Because I think that's the difference. I think that's the difference right there, if I may, for a minute. The 2 teams largely share a kind of broad philosophy as to how they want to win football games. They want to dominate the line of scrimmage. Oklahoma has recruited good offensive linemen and defensive linemen. Speaking of Oklahoma, I mentioned this being a mirror match a minute ago. Oklahoma has defensive linemen like John Mateer that they're really excited about. They have David Stone and Jaden Jackson. Michigan has young offensive linemen like Andrew Babaloa that they're very excited about. Oklahoma has Michael Fasusi. So these teams are very, very similar in a lot of ways, but there are some subtle differences, and I want to kind of point those out here. So philosophy-wise, they're the same, but the way they approach the game schematically is a little different. And this is really what I think Michigan should watch out for. This is kind of my scouting report, if you will, on the Oklahoma Sooners, at least schematically, in this upcoming season. Now, obviously, Ben Arbuckle and more importantly, Brent Venables have been here for a few seasons now. Ben Arbuckle, I think, is actually in year 2 now. Came along with John Mateer, the starting quarterback for this team, but you get what I'm saying. Oklahoma, at least to start to get into their schematic identity offensively, is the Ben Arbuckle system, which is a combination of old and new, I think is the best way to phrase it, the best way to describe it. And it makes for a very interesting offense because you see a little bit of Mike Leach in this offense. You see a little bit of, well, even like some Kurt Signetti type of stuff in this offense where they're calling a ton of heavy RPO. They're spreading you out a bit. They're putting 4 receivers on the field, or they're putting you in a, they're coming out with a Y with a tight end, but the tight end will kind of motion out sometimes into the slot, and you end up in these interesting formations. And then John Mateer has a running back in the backfield, and he can call an RPO, and depending on the look that he gets, he'll either run the football, hand it off, or pass the football himself. But the interesting thing about this offense is while it's doing all of those modern things, it's also blending it with some old school gap scheme running. When you watch the film on Oklahoma, they'll look like a 2026 modern up-tempo, pass-heavy offense. And then the next thing you know, they're running duo like it's 1948, and this team is coached by, or I guess a better reference would be, it's the early 2000s Oklahoma Sooners back in their heyday, and they're running downhill at you with Adrian Peterson. They're running split zone, they're running GT counter, they're running duo, they're running all the things that a power running team would like to run. So it's really kind of a two-headed monster in a way. But just to kind of flip it over to Michigan, this is where this matchup is really interesting because Jay Hill comes in and I think runs a defense that's a little more capable of slowing down Oklahoma's offense. And now Oklahoma's offense might kind of tail off the season a bit. They don't have Deion Burks there. They've lost actually a couple of their starting wide receivers. They've lost a couple of offensive linemen. So Michigan's defensive line may be able to be more competitive this season, especially on the interior than they were on the exterior. In fact, it's going to be a really interesting matchup out on the edge. John Henry Daly going up against Michael Fasusi, who I mentioned just a minute ago. Michael Fasusi is a true sophomore, albeit a former 5-star coming out of high school. We'll see if those 5 stars were really warranted coming out of high school. He's going to be put to the test by John Henry Daly out on the edge. That's Oklahoma's offense. And it's a really interesting offense. It's a difficult offense to slow down because, again, the up-tempo stuff causes your defense to kind of have to stay in the same personnel for multiple snaps in a row. You can't rotate as much. And then, they'll call RPO up tempo, and then the next thing you know, you're getting hit with old school split zone, and your defensive tackles are worn out because they just had to play 5, 6, 7 plays in a row, and they couldn't get off the field to rotate. So it's a really difficult offense to slow down. But I do think, again, Jay Hill, with the kind of multiple looks that he can give, the fact that he can run a little 3-4, he'll run a little single high, he'll put a safety in the box. I think he's a little more capable with his scheme of slowing down this Oklahoma Sooners offense, which does, of course, have John Mateer, who is a good college quarterback. I wouldn't say he's great. I wouldn't say he's elite. Definitely not like a Heisman contender, but you're kind of prototypical run around, avoid pressure, make plays happen kind of guy. I like to joke that he's a bit of a discount Johnny Manziel in some ways. You'll see him try to roll out of the pocket. You'll see him try to hit some, open receivers downfield by extending plays. And that's going to be a key for this Michigan defense as well. But the key to slowing down the Oklahoma Sooners offense, I think, is largely slowing down that running game and being able to match tempo. Now, the defense for Oklahoma, and I'm going to kind of give something away here. This is really the reason why I wanted to make this video, because I have to be honest, and I think that's what I owe you guys, and that's really a big reason why I started this channel, is because I want to give you guys honest, frank, factual information. I don't want to just sugarcoat things. I don't want to just pile on with the hype when there are reasons for concern or reasons to think Michigan might have a difficult time in this one. I'm going to be honest and upfront with you guys. That's all to say that I think Oklahoma's defense, and we kind of saw a little bit of this last year, is tailor-made to slow down Michigan's offense, or at least from what I understand, Jason Beck likes to do. If you know anything about defensive schemes, if you know anything about Brent Venables, he's probably... No, I don't even want to say probably. I know for a fact, because I've been watching this man coach college football since he was at Clemson. He's the most aggressive defensive coordinator in college football. In fact, he puts Don Brown to shame. But he does it in a way that allows his defense to be highly productive and slow down college offenses at a much higher rate than Don Brown ever did. You remember through the years of Clemson winning national championships and being highly competitive, there were some high-powered offenses that Brent Venables was really able to slow down. It's an extremely aggressive, primarily single high man defense that'll play a lot of man coverage, that I think at times will play a little bit of cover 3, and they do at times put two safeties to run two high safeties, and will run things like cover 4, but it's kind of like the old Mark D'Antonio cover 4. If you know anything about the old Mark D'Antonio cover 4, it was two high safeties covering the middle of the field. Of course, the corners outside also have their deep quarters to cover. That's why it's called quarters coverage. You have two safeties in the middle covering two quarters, two corners on either side covering a quarter each themselves as well. Those two high safeties trigger to stop the run real easily and really hard. So what it does is basically turns cover 4 into like cover 0 essentially real quick, where your safeties are crashing down into the box to stop the run really quick. This defense is aggressive. They fly downhill, and what they do it really well because they do it disciplined. That's one thing I really want to communicate to you guys, and we saw it last season. What this defense specializes in is slowing down those long developing plays. And what do I mean by long developing plays? Well, a long developing play is a little jet sweep, or a handoff with some pre-snap motion, or a little screen, where you're trying to get blockers out, or you're trying to pull someone around, or you're trying to do some fancy things in the backfield to set yourself up for success downfield. This defense flies downfield and tries to get into the backfield quickly, in a timely manner each and every snap. It's actually really impressive. But what they do really effectively is they'll stay in their lanes as they do come downfield. And if you know anything about defensive schemes, defensive coverage, there's always usually a force player, a spill player, etc., that has kind of outside contain for any given running play. And they'll come downhill, and they're responsible for a certain lane or a certain gap to make sure that a run play doesn't explode. Rarely in a Brent Venables defense is somebody coming down to play that role and that they're out of position. So I'm a little concerned, knowing Jason Beck's offense and how they like to run a little misdirection, and having watched the film on Utah from last season, where they're pulling guys around and they're faking a handoff here just to hand it off to a wide receiver on an end around there. They're running these long developing things, and the next thing you know, the safeties have triggered and they're coming downfield, and the linebackers have already triggered, and we haven't even gotten into it yet. But the defensive line largely one gaps as opposed to two gaps. And I could go on a rant about the difference between one gapping and two gapping. What I will say is that Michigan and most college football teams, largely, Michigan under like the Mike McDonald, Jesse Minter, and now Jay Hill defense, will largely play and have largely played two gap. What a two gap technique is, in short, is that your defensive tackles are responsible for multiple gaps along the offensive line. So they're not necessarily looking to just pummel somebody into the backfield on every play. They're trying to fill those gaps and stop the running back for merely a 1 or 2 yard gain, or hopefully a 0 yard gain. Largely, that's what they do. They're trying to contain, they're trying to stop, they're trying to get into the backfield somewhat, but they have to keep in the back of their minds at all times that they're responsible for those two gaps. And if they just shoot into one gap, they know that if they miss their responsibility in their other gap, that the running back could easily sidestep them, get into that open gap, and have a huge gain. Oklahoma doesn't care about any of that. Brent Venables does not care about that. his defensive linemen, and he has some really good ones this year in the form of Jaden Jackson, a nose tackle, and David Stone, a defensive tackle slash edge, whatever you want to call it, when they're playing like a 3-down front. They're shooting their gap on every play. They're trying to get into the backfield. They don't care about merely stopping you for like a 0-yard gain or a 1-yard gain or a 2-yard gain. They are trying to murder you. And they do that because they know that the linebackers will fill their gap behind them. That's largely what the whole defense is based on. So if you're running that kind of long developing stuff, Oklahoma's going to kill you. Now, there's always a cost to that, right? You can only throw so many players into the box without having to pay a price on the back end. That's basic college football. That's basic football generally, whether you're talking college, NFL, or the Canadian leagues for that matter. The thing I'm concerned about here is the fact that this game happened so early in the schedule. And we have heard about Bryce Underwood and how he's coming along. We got more word from Kyle Whittingham and company, who are all guests on the Rich Eisen show today, that Bryce Underwood is developing, that the passing game is developing. The one weakness, and this doesn't matter where you look, all over the internet, you can read article after article on Brent Venables' defense. The weakness to this defense is they are really, really terrible at giving up. They frequently, I should say, give up big passing plays. And that's really where I want to get to my analysis slash my, you probably read the title of this video, and we're just now getting into it 21 minutes in. Welcome to Darren Talks Ball, everybody. I am a rambly guy here, in case you haven't noticed. That's where I want to get into my 5 keys to this game. 5 things Michigan must do to win this game, etc., however exactly I end up titling it. If Michigan really wants to win this game, I think they're going to have to get out of those situations where they're bogged down, Oklahoma's crashing downhill, they're slowing down the run game, they're getting into the backfield. Bryce Underwood's going to have to hit some big plays in this game, in the passing game. You're going to have to make Oklahoma pay the price, because if you go back and you watch the film from last season, Oklahoma did not respect Bryce Underwood and his ability to throw the football. Now, am I hopeful that he'll be able to do that? Absolutely. Absolutely, I am. But early in the season, in just the second game of the season, it's a question mark. It is. And while the rushing game will also certainly be good to great for Michigan this season, we have to admit Oklahoma is going to sell out to stop the run. That's just their game plan. That's what they do to any given opponent, and I think that'll especially be the case because Brent Venables knows Michigan has Jordan Marshall. Brent Venables knows that Kyle Whittingham likes to run the football. Brent Venables knows exactly what Michigan wants to do, and he's going to sell out to stop to do that. So how do you hit that with a counterpunch? You hit some big plays over the middle, down the sideline, whatever you got to do in the passing game. Now, the nice thing is Michigan's wide receivers have certainly upgraded this season. That wide receiver room is certainly better with guys like Jamie French and J.J. Buchanan. Andrew Marsh is a much better receiver now than he was in just the second game of the season last year. In fact, he was not nearly as much of a factor early in the season last season as he ended up being later in the season. So that's a thing going for Michigan. I do see them being able to hit some big plays in the passing game. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that that's something that they'll probably have to do to keep drives going and put enough points on the board to win this game. And I've already kind of gone over number 2, so I'm not going to kind of sit and dwell on it for too long, but I want to see Michigan avoid those long developing plays where, again, they're doing a lot of the kind of misdirection. There's the misdirection pre-snap where you could put a guy in motion. Then there's kind of misdirection stuff post-snap where you've got, a wide receiver running around on an orbit motion and you're making it look like it might be an end around, and then you hand it off to the running back. If you take too much time, David Stone's in your face. That's just, I know Michigan's offensive line, with guys like Jake Guarnera in the middle and Evan Lake moving over will be pretty good, but David Stone is also pretty good. We have to admit that here. And like any game of college football, Michigan's going to have to win the rushing battle and time of possession in this one. They're going to need to control the pace of the game and keep their defense rested so that their defense is able and capable of slowing down John Mateer and company. And then defensively for Michigan, I put up there the Jalen Milroe game plan. This is another area where I kind of like Jay Hill's defensive scheme against this offense because he said it in interviews. People have detailed it in their articles about his defense and what he's done in the past. I've seen it myself on film. John Mateer, similar kind of to Jalen Milroe, although I think Jalen Milroe was a far more athletic quarterback, is a guy that can kind of scramble around or he can make plays happen with his feet. If you hit him with pressure, yes, he can leak out of the pocket and make a play here or there. And Jalen Milroe certainly did that in the Alabama game against Michigan in 2023 in the Rose Bowl. Don't get me wrong. But he wasn't able to do it to the extent that got him, enough big plays to win the game. Michigan, under Jesse Minter, largely ran a ton of stunts and, sim pressures and twists and things that threw Alabama's offensive line into a state of confusion to where Michigan's defensive line was able to get the kind of pressure on Jalen Milroe that slowed down even an athletic quarterback. In other words, it got there so quickly, and it was also so disciplined in terms of everybody staying in their rushing lane that Jalen Milroe's legs were largely a non-factor at certain points in that game. In order to win this game, I think you might see the same kind of game plan from Jay Hill, just knowing how similar his defensive fronts are to Jesse Minter's in some ways, and the way he'll run those twists and stunts and sim pressures, and knowing that John Mateer isn't exactly the same kind of quarterback, but is also an athletic quarterback who can scramble around. And then the big key, number 5, you can't go 3 of 14 on third down and expect to win like they did last season. You just can't. You can't do that against a Washington or an Illinois, let alone an Oklahoma team that comes into the season ranked, I think it's 12th in ESPN FPI and up there in SP Plus as well. So those are my 5 keys, the 5 things Michigan must do to beat Oklahoma this season, kind of an early preview of the game. If you guys enjoyed this one, please let me know in the comments. Let me know how I'm doing generally with this channel. Please give this video a like, get it up in that almighty algorithm, subscribe, help us get us to our goal of 1,000 subscribers. And until next time, as always, be kind to other people out there.